Our speaker today, Jason Saucier from Saucier. Uh, he said he deals with that all the time. So, well, what's your name? It's not. But uh, Jason is the director of the Shrimp and Crab Bureau, which is part of the DMR. He's got grew up in the Biloxi area, went to USM, got a degree in marine biology, and in 2014 he went to work for DMR in the Shrimp and Crab Bureau. And having the opportunity to sit down and visit with him before at lunch, he's got a wealth of knowledge, and things that you think you understood, you find out, well, no, that wasn't really how it happens out there. You know, where the shrimp go, they come in, the brown shrimp, the white shrimp, the crabs. Why do you catch more males than females? Just goes on and on with that. And one common myth, I grew up here, and all my life we had porpoises out in the bay. Well, we don't. There's no porpoises here. They're all bottlenose dolphins. So you have to take porpoise out of your vernacular. They don't exist here. All right? So there's nothing like education, right, to get you on the right foot. So, well, Jason, come on up. We'll turn this over to you. I might have hit some buttons. Okay.
Good afternoon. I need to be here, right? Good afternoon. I'm Jason. Thank y'all for inviting me here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with y'all. I'm going to go over a little bit of history and then go into some of the science that we do, because that's what I know more of, is the science side. I do have, like I said, a little bit of historical perspective on the fisheries here in Mississippi. Happy to take any questions y'all might have about the history. But I want to talk a little bit more about what we do to manage our fisheries now, just some of our methodologies in managing the various fisheries we have here in our state waters. So just an introduction there. We're going to look at past and present industries we've got here. It has changed significantly over the last 100 plus years, and the way things look in our fisheries here due to a number of reasons, and we'll talk about that. Look at some advancing technologies, some tools that we use that help us collect data to make informed decisions as resource managers. And then some of the different types of data that we use. So I know it's right after lunch and it's kind of heavy topics after a heavy lunch, but we'll try to not have too many folks snoozing. So like I said, historical commercial fisheries. When we think of the Mississippi Gulf Coast, a lot of people have heard that we were the seafood capital. We're the seafood capital of the world, for good reason. There was a lot of processing facilities here, and a lot of folks came to the area starting in the late 1800s because of the resources that we had available here and because of the demand. Things have changed over the last few decades, and a lot of that has to do with the demand and the introduction of other sources of seafood that have changed the demand here locally, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. The main fisheries, we're all familiar with: shrimp, oyster, blue crab, and finfish fisheries. Within the finfish fishery, we kind of look at it as different. There's different purposes for our seafood, right? So we all eat fish, those of us that recreationally fish, and the folks that don't. We eat fish, most of us in the room. Does anybody not eat fish? Maybe has an allergy. But that fish that we're eating is coming from a commercial fisherman, unless we caught it, right? And so we're all familiar with that, but there's a couple other fisheries. The menhaden reduction fishery is still one that's present here. It has seen a significant reduction in operations over the last, I'm not too familiar with that fishery directly, but over the last couple of decades, there's less and less of those boats and companies that operate those boats in existence today. But those facilities and their boats, the intention of that operation of that fishery is for production of oil specifically. So they are using the meal, the stuff that the byproduct for other things, but oil, omega-3, is what they're after in that fishery. Pet food, that was a pretty large fishery here in Mississippi for a number of years. That's been gone since the early 90s, I believe. There was a plant in Biloxi on the Back Bay. Everybody remembers Cozy Kitten, probably heard of Cozy Kitten. It was eventually bought out by Heinz Company and shut down a couple of years after that. But they were targeting what would be considered by some as bycatch species, so forage species. So they were targeting spot, Atlantic croaker, and other things. That's predominantly what they were catching, and they were doing that with a trawl fishery that was operated predominantly offshore, and that was to make, as Cozy Kitten sounds, it was make pet food. So we still do have some commercial fisheries on finfish that are targeting red drum, spotted sea trout, striped mullet, and maybe a few other species. The landings of those other species is pretty low, but in the landings in these commercial fisheries has been relatively low over the last few years. It's getting to be less and less landings commercially and more recreationally. So I just wanted to put this in there. This is probably not, you probably can't read that, but I'll read some of it to you. But this is from an article, I'm not sure of the newspaper, but this was sent to me by one of our folks that used to work at the agency that's very involved still in fisheries management. And it's just very interesting to look back to 1892 and see how much production was going on. This was really at the inception of the seafood industry. And at this point in time, as you'll see in another slide, we didn't have seafood regulations back then because there wasn't a need until this started coming up. So I'll read a little bit. It looks like it was an article in Washington, and I don't know the name of the paper, but it was
previous articles in the Picayune.
Times-Picayune.
It says in previous articles.
Okay, there you go. So it was republished in 1892. So it talks about our coastline there. Point of Shanes, folks that are familiar with Pascagoula are familiar with that area. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the value. I'm going to try to look at this while I'm still on the mic here. So in 1880, the nominal increase in the fishery interest in it. Let's skip forward there. The number of persons engaged in the fishing industry has increased 825%. The capital devoted to the business has increased 4,839%, and the value of the products has increased 990%. The fishery resources of the states, especially the waters for oyster culture, are still capable of much development. And the history of the past decade indicates that in a short time, Mississippi will become one of the foremost oyster-producing states. And then it goes on to say the extent of the commercial fishery. 1,809 persons were employed in the fishery in 1889 and 1,721 in 1890, of whom more than half each year were employed onshore in canneries, packing houses, etc. The vessel fisheries are seen to have required the services of much fewer men than the shore or boat fisheries. The nationalities of the persons employed in the fisheries of the state was chiefly American, only 78 persons in 1890 being aliens. Of the Americans, about 1/5 are colored people who are chiefly employed on shore. The largest number of foreigners obtained obtain employment on the vessels, and none are found in the shore industries. The capital invested in the fisheries of this state was $433,300 in 1889 and $434,710 in 1890. The investment is made up largely of shore property and cash capital employed in the canning and other related branches. I'm not going to read the rest of that, but pretty interesting. What really drew my attention to the article was the percentage increase in capital investment and increase in number of facilities being opened up. So this was right at the beginning of when our fisheries really took off, and a lot of this had to do with advances in technology. Over the course of our fisheries here on the coast, in the last 100 years, we've seen a lot of changes in technology, but most of y'all are already aware, historically, it was sail-powered vessels, very inefficient, as you can imagine. Oysters and shrimp were harvested that way. Predominantly oysters, and a lot of our shrimp that were being harvested were being harvested with beach seines until steam power came about. So the steam engine was really a big reason that it increased in the early 1900s, and then the big jump we saw after that was rail access from our local canneries and refrigeration that allowed it to get out to bigger markets. So I don't have any of that information on the presentation, but that was what really put us on the map. And then we had some entrepreneurs in our processing facilities that really developed these new technologies and made it what it was. All right, I want to talk a little bit about what's changed in regulations, because I work for a regulatory agency. We are the ones that write the state laws and enforce those state laws currently. That's changed over time. I'll talk to you a little bit about that. But there are also another layer of laws, federal laws, that come into play with certain fisheries, predominantly the finfish fishery and those offshore species like red snapper, cobia, things like that are migratory species are also managed under federal laws. Okay, environmental conditions have changed. We're all well aware of hurricanes, the oil spill, and the Bonnie Carey spillway operation. But there's also been other inputs that are not specific events that occurred on specific dates that have progressively changed conditions over the course of the last 100 years. And a lot of that anthropogenic input has to do with development in and around the shoreline. So anybody that's looked at maps that, historical maps compared to now, it's pretty plain. You can see what's changed over time. And a lot of the shore fringe habitat, specifically tidal marsh and oyster reefs, are nursery grounds. We all know that for most of our inshore species. All the finfish that are inshore species targeted by recreational and commercial fishermen, all the shrimp, the crabs, they all have at least part of their life cycle that occurs in and around these nursery habitats. So the changes have included habitat loss, and then also, even though it's not direct, impacts from water quality. Okay, so all of our stormwater runs out eventually into these estuaries, whether it's treated or not. And so a lot of that water quality is not, it's discrete events that happen periodically, but those eventually have impacts on the fishery, especially when these species are in their early life stages and they're very susceptible to these environmental changes. Okay? So I want to read to you while we're still on this slide. Make sure. Yeah, I kind of skipped through. Sorry about that. I didn't see the photos there. All right. I want to read to y'all what's up here from a. Does anybody have are familiar with those books, they put them out. Our agency put these out in the early to mid 90s. It's a 3-volume set. It's a history of marine resources on the Gulf Coast, and it's got a lot of historical information on our communities. Is anybody familiar with those? Folks that have lived here a long time, they published them, I think it was in the mid 90s, and gave out a bunch of copies, and I just happen to have one. And the volumes cover different topics, but they're very comprehensive, I'd say. They talk about a lot of different industries by community, and then a lot of different things about our landscape, okay? So what I want to talk about...
This man right here contributed an article to that book.
Really? Okay. Thank you for doing that. What article was it?
I did one on food, and I did another one on something else, and I can't remember.
Okay. Well, thank you for contributing. And there's a lot of articles. So the articles are contributed by all kinds of different local folks. There's some local historians and some scientists and lawmakers that contributed on different topics. But I'm not sure if these are available online, but it would certainly be good to look into getting a copy, at least for the society, as a reference document. So what I'm going to read to you is from Volume 3, and this is in relation to historical state management of our marine resources. And I just wanted to kind of talk about, there's been a progression since the late 1800s of who's in charge of managing our resources. And so you'll see there in 1896, Mississippi's marine resources law stretched back to the start of the 20th century. The legislature granted the boards of supervisors in Hancock, Harrison, and Jackson counties full jurisdiction and authority in their respective counties for the protection and preservation of oysters, crabs, saltwater fish, and shrimp. Okay, so that was the first step. That was the first set of laws, or the legislature saying that this or these agencies will make the laws and determine things like seasonal openings and closures. Okay, and then in 1902, the legislature created the Board of Oyster Commissioners. It consisted of 5 members appointed by the governor to supervise oyster catching and canning, audit the accounts of people engaged in the oyster business, collect license fees and privilege taxes, and hear complaints. Okay, so obviously there was a change that occurred within 6 years there. So there was a large need, based on a large amount of effort that was going on in the fishery, for them to have a dedicated board of commissioners to determine how to properly manage this fishery. Okay? All right, and the next one comes in 1930. The Mississippi Seafood Commission was created. State law gave the commission jurisdiction over all seafood living or existing in the state marine waters. The jurisdiction included oysters, saltwater fish, saltwater shrimp, diamondback terrapin, sea turtles, crabs, and other marine or saltwater animal life. The Seafood Commission was authorized to make rules regulating the manner, time, and location of catching seafood, and could prohibit the catching of seafood under certain circumstances. The state law also transferred the responsibilities previously carried out by the Oyster Commission to the newly created commission. Okay? We don't see the next change until 1960 with a House bill that created the Mississippi Marine Conservation Commission. And the legislature declared to be public policy to recognize the need for a concerted effort to work toward the protection, propagation, and conservation of its seafood and aquatic life in connection with the revitalization of the seafood industry of the state of Mississippi. The 10-member commission was charged to manage, control, supervise, and direct any matters pertaining to all saltwater aquatic life. Okay, we don't see another change until 1970. The legislature created the Mississippi Marine Resources Council. The purpose of this 16-member council was to study and develop plans, proposals, reports, and recommendations for the development and utilization of states' coastal and offshore lands, waters, and marine resources. So this particular group had a little bit of a different purpose and function. It was to work in concert with the Marine Conservation Commission, and this had to do more so with development of lands and strategizing the development of the coast. Okay? Then in 1978, all the duties of those two groups that were created in 1960 and 1970, those were consolidated into the Bureau of Marine Resources, which was within the Department of Wildlife and Conservation. Okay? In 1990, the department was reorganized into what it is today, which is the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks. And then in 1994, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources was created. So that's the agency I currently work for. It was created as well as the commission, okay? Commission on Marine Resources. In 2020, the legislature wrote law to change the Commission on Marine Resources to an advisory commission. And so the authority is all under the executive director of the agency. The advisory commission still meets monthly. The purpose of the commission is to make recommendations to the director and to show any actions that are occurring within the agency as far as decision making for management. Are there any questions so far? Y'all can stop me at any point. This is kind of dry material, but we're going to get into some fun stuff. All right. I want to talk a little bit about present day commercial. So one of the commercial fisheries that's doing really well right now is the blue crab fishery. We've got a pretty steady amount of license holders in the fishery, whether they be recreational or commercial. In other fisheries, we are experiencing trends in less and less effort, and that's specifically the shrimp fishery and the oyster fishery is kind of an obvious thing because we haven't had a season since the spillway was opened in 2019. But the shrimp fishery across the Gulf, not just in state waters in Mississippi, but every in-state fishery and federal fishery is seeing a consistent trend and a decline in license sales and in landings. And that's not because of the resource, it's because of the economics associated with that fishery. So the blue crab fishery, what really drives these commercial fisheries is a demand that basically results in a price that's good for them to make money. Okay, so what we're seeing with the shrimp fishery is down, prices are down or they're stagnant since the 70s, pretty much, in wholesale shrimp. Everything else is inflation. We're all experiencing inflation right now. We've seen inflation since the 70s 2 or 3 times. And right now we're seeing wholesale prices that are equivalent to what they were in the 70s. That's pretty crazy when you think about it. Everything else has increased. So that's why we see a lot of shrimp boats that just sit at the dock right now. So crabbing's not quite the same. A lot of people don't realize this, but crabs, we like to eat crabs here on the coast, but they really like to eat crabs on the East Coast. They really like to eat crabs, and they'll pay whatever for them too. So a lot of our northern Gulf crabs end up on the East Coast in the Chesapeake area. So if you eat at a crab house, you may not be eating Maryland crabs. You're probably eating Louisiana crabs, statistically speaking. So a lot of those, and this is live market, boiled or steamed crabs, a lot of them get sent up to the East Coast, and that means because there's such a high demand and they can't supply what they need in the Chesapeake, prices are good and fishermen can make money. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about regulations while we're on this slide. So can y'all see the red square? Y'all know what that is? You can't really see the black thing, but so that those were required by law, and they're now required by law in most other states, if not all. But this is one example, a little visual example of what we've done recently to make sure that we are minimizing bycatch and trying to get the undersized crabs out. So those, hang on one second, let me get So those are called escape rings, or the crabbers call them coal rings, but basically they're designed to allow the smaller stuff out of the trap, including the crabs that are too small. So right now in the state of Mississippi, you got to have one in each chamber on the side, one side wall. We do give those out to the fishermen for free through a grant program to help offset the cost, but everybody's used to putting them in by now. That's been in there since 2017. So this other one is not a mandatory thing, but this is something that we're promoting. Does anybody know what that is? That's it. Yep. So it's a TED. It's another kind of TED than most people think of it, but it's a terrapin excluder device. And so we give those out to anybody that wants them. We've got them at the office. They're funded through a grant, but it prevents terrapins of a certain size from even being able to get into the trap. And so that's one thing that we do to minimize the impact from the fishery. Another thing that we do, we just had a cleanup a few weeks ago. Very successful. We try to involve the public as much as we can. And so we do a closure ahead of these cleanups. We do them every 2 to 3 years as needed. And we've got some other programs that we're planning for later this year where we're going to do some directed effort using drone technology and side scan technology to try to get the traps that volunteers can't easily see from their vessel or from the shore. So one of those will be subsurface recovery. So the ones that are cork lines are cut off and they're never exposed at low tide, that's the ones that we're going after with that program. And we've done it on a pilot scale. We're just hoping with the grant money that we can expand it to other areas. And go ahead.
I have a question. Has the population of crabs along the Mississippi coast increased or decreased in the last couple of years?
It has increased in the last 3 or 4 years. So based on our sampling and our landings data, commercial landings data, which I'll talk about the differences there, we're seeing an increase in recruitment of small juveniles and of market-sized crabs. So we're catching more in the nets, catching more in our fishery independent trap work, and we're seeing it transpire to higher landings, which is good. So a lot of people don't necessarily know this, but a lot of so crabs are almost an annual crop. Shrimp are definitely an annual crop. Crabs are a little bit longer lived, but we manage them. We manage our shrimp fishery specifically as an annual crop. So we're trying to protect this year's crop when we close it in the spring, because shrimpers here that operate in our waters, they got one shot at each shrimp, right? They only have 1 year that they're here at most, and then they're gone. So we try to make sure that they're not harvesting until they're of market size, and so that they get more money for their product. Similarly with crabs, we don't do a seasonal closure, but we close the bays to commercial activity. We do that with a lot of our every commercial fishery in an effort to preserve the nursery area where a lot of the smaller ones are and allow them to grow before they're harvested. Now, we do allow recreational harvest in the bays, and a lot of our recreational crabbers do set their traps or they run their drop nets in the bays, but the effort's a lot lower theoretically. That may not always be the case. If effort continues to increase and harvest continues to increase like it does with other recreational fisheries, we have to look at that too. But getting back to your question, annual crop species, we see fluctuations that are cyclical on a 3 to 4 year cycle in population. And a lot of it is tied to localized environmental conditions. Some things we are aware of, but some things we can't really put our finger on, but they happen. So with crustaceans, they have early life stages that are larval life stages where they're planktonic. And we might see high recruitment in that life stage, but then when we look at the data for the juveniles and adults and the landings data, it doesn't correlate at all. So something happened there. It wasn't a harvester that took all the plankton out. It was environmental conditions that caused that, whatever happened. So it can be currents in the Gulf of Mexico that cause it. It can be localized rainfall, has a lot to do with shrimp and crab production. Not just Bonnie Carey impacts, but when our local rivers swell and we get wet springs, that typically transpires to a good crab season the next year because they have better access to forage and cover habitat. So it floods the marsh, and the fish can't get to the small crabs to eat them because everything eats small crabs in the water column. So what it does is it preserves, or it's less mortality in the juveniles. It's opposite, and they can tolerate low salinity. It's opposite with shrimp. So generally, a warm, dry spring results in a good recruitment for brown shrimp. So it's not necessarily on the same cycle, but those localized annual conditions have a lot to do with what we see the next year or that same year. Warm, dry springs are good for shrimp because the higher the water temperature and the saltier, the quicker they grow and get out into the sound, and the less mortality we have of the juveniles in the bays. All right, so I'm not going to show you a whole lot of graphs with effort and science data, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about the shrimp fishery. I mentioned to you already the trends. So this is just a good visual of the trends. These are two separate, can anybody read that?
Yeah.
Okay, I know the people in the back can't. So the top figure there shows license sales, just shrimp, shrimp license sale. That's commercial and recreational. The red is commercial, the blue is recreational. We see decline in both, right? That's a pretty steady decrease, all right? We see some big drops a couple of years. So this is 06, 07. That's right after what? Katrina. All right. And then we see a big spike, but right here, 09 and 10. That was BP. Okay. Since BP, we had a little blip here where there was a pretty sharp decline. It's been a steady decline. Okay. The bottom figure is number of shrimp vessels that we count on opening day. So does anybody remember what opening day used to look like? I've heard a bunch of people say it, but you could walk across the boats, literally. So last year, actually this is not updated completely. Last year we had 35 boats total. And so we do count on the water, but we also do an aerial survey, so we get an accurate count. So we fly the whole sound and outside the islands, and we count every boat on opening day. And
What's the number on the left side of the chart? Like, what are the bigger numbers?
so the first one is 1995 and 1996.
But what number of boats was out there then?
That was 1,268. So we see a pretty sharp decline starting in 03, but again, this is 06. It goes in half because that's when Katrina hit, right?
Even though the number of boats was down this past year, was the number of shrimp up? Where I'm going with this is Corky and I lived by each other, and during the shrimping season this past year, from 5 o'clock in the morning till midnight, we had people throwing nets into the bayou, and in a half hour they were filling up their igloo. I don't care what the size was. I had never seen anything like it. It went on for weeks.
So specifically this last year, we've seen a good year this year for sure. I will say that, brown and white shrimp. So the white shrimp showed up early. They showed up in June. Usually don't see those till late summer. And the brown shrimp stuck around too, but just from my interactions with the fishermen, because we do try to engage the fishermen, how's it looking, that kind of thing, because it's better than just us collecting data. The issue with the fishery now is not production of resource. It has to do with economics exclusively. So the guys catching with the cast net's a perfect example. They're catching it for free,
Yeah,
and they know where it came from, and it's all they can handle.
yeah.
So the shrimpers that I know that work, the ones that I talk to operate out of Ocean Springs Harbor, and they fish either in the Sound. Sometimes they go to Louisiana, or sometimes they go to Mobile Bay. But when the shrimp are here, they operate here because the fuel is so expensive. They would go out for 2 or 3 hours and catch their self-imposed quota. So that's filling up the boat with as much as they're able to sell within 2 days, but while the shrimp is still good. So you're talking about 2 to 3 hours. They might catch 1,500 pounds in 2 to 3 hours, and they literally can't sell that shrimp before it goes bad at the dock, because that's what they're doing. They're peddling shrimp because that's the only way they can make money.
On that end, the royal red shrimp, the huge one,
Mm-hmm.
how far out do they go to get those, and how deep do they go to get them?
I'm not as familiar with it, with that fishery, because that's executed offshore, but it's probably 400 to 800 foot of water,
Right.
and it's off the coast of Florida. But there's only about 2 families that operate in that fishery at this point in the whole Gulf of Mexico. So the vast majority of what you see at the restaurant that's sold as Royal Reds is actually Argentinian red, which is another warm water, maybe a cold water species. So very little bit is harvested. We're talking, when I say very little bit, it would be on the order of maybe 60,000 pounds harvested for the whole year in the Gulf of Mexico. That's not a lot when you spread it across restaurants. So when it's sold as Royal Reds, more than likely it's not. And there's a way you can tell, but I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, I had always heard it was off of Destin,
That's probably correct.
and I heard 1,500 feet.
It may be. It's sort of a,
How do they get down that deep with nets, or how do they catch it?
so they just have really big boats with big spools of cable, yeah. So a lot of those boats are offshore boats, obviously, but they're down in Florida harvesting pink shrimp, which is where most of the pink shrimp come from. And this is sort of an opportunistic fishery. They might go check if they're not catching a lot of pink shrimp.
My other question on what impact do the imports from China and Vietnam?
That's what the impact is.
That was my question.
Yeah, so
Price is stagnant, so-
yeah, so that's why the price is stagnant, and that's why we saw a lot of work in the 90s. There were some issues where imports weren't as big a picture or as big a part of the picture until now, until the early 2000s is when countries started ramping up production in aquaculture and import or export into the U.S.
And doesn't Louisiana restrict restaurants how they sell Louisiana?
They got some legislation passed a few years ago in Louisiana to require it. They've had some issues with being able to enforce it, and so I mentioned this to Chris earlier. They were either working on legislation or got it passed last year to try to give, because the original legislation was developed through their Department of Health, is how they finally got it through. The Department of Health doesn't have a lot of enforcement and folks, people that can write tickets. So they were trying to get new legislation to give the authority to LDWF so that their law enforcement officers could go into restaurants and write tickets for non-compliance. But
Mississippi.
we don't have anything.
Considering
It would be, I will say, it would be a difficult thing based on what experience Louisiana had, because it sounds easy, but the restaurants have a lot of support in Jackson. They're a powerful group. There's the Restaurant Association, so it's you got to look at it, kind of step back and look. How do you get this done? And it would be difficult because the restaurants look at it from a different angle. It's a bottom line thing for them, and if their consumer is not asking about where that seafood's from, then they don't have a reason to change, unless there's a compliance thing, or unless it's on the menu, and then people start asking. So the only thing we can do as an agency, because we can't we don't have control over legislation directly, and it's hard for us to get things like that pushed through. Is to try to engage the public and make them aware that they need to ask the restaurants when they go eat, where's the shrimp coming from? But I can say most restaurants, even here in places where you would expect it, like New Orleans, most of what you eat's not domestic shrimp, unless it says it on the menu. And that's usually at the higher end restaurants. So we can make that behavior change, but the consumer behavior has to change first. And we would never be able to provide enough shrimp to satisfy market demand in the U.S. So domestically, we consume about 7.5 billion pounds of shrimp a year, Americans do. And of that, 500 million is domestically caught. So that even if we were to double the size of the fleet, we still couldn't fulfill market demand. So, but we could certainly move the needle if we changed it locally. There was another question here.
My question was that.
But yes, that is in a nutshell the issue with the shrimp fishery is import competition. So the shrimp industry has worked hard to try to combat dumping of imported shrimp into the U.S. market with tariffs and fines, but the countries that are exporting to the U.S. will continue to do so as long as they're still making money, their companies. And some of those governments are subsidizing those facilities, which is unfortunate because it's not a fair playing field with our local shrimpers.
Is the quality of the shrimp close to the same from import as it is from domestic?
I've not seen any evidence directly. So one of the things that's been talked about is testing for antibiotics and steroids and things like that. I'm not aware of any research that's been done on it here and what's being consumed here, but I think that would be a good thing to look into. It's a different species, I will say that, but it's as far as you being able to taste the difference, I don't know that there would be a perceivable taste difference from an imported shrimp to a domestic shrimp. You'd be able to discern that, but there are some folks in Louisiana that are working on testing some of that stuff that's served to see if there are in fact evidence of hormones and things like that, things that we don't want consumers to get, because that would be a way to do it.
How about the freshness of the fish? If it's not flown in the day it's caught.
Mm-hmm. So frozen shrimp can be treated, and non-frozen shrimp can be treated. It does sometimes leave a taste, an iodine taste, but there's a treatment that they can put on shrimp to retain water, make it retain water when it's thawed. I don't know how much of that's treated that way, and I don't know how long it takes for it to get from a pond in Ecuador to a processing facility here. I don't know how long that market chain takes, but you would think there'd be some evidence of it. But there's got to be a chemical additive to preserve that quality. One of the other things I wanted to mention is there has been a change in techniques. We've seen a trend and change from otter trawls. Historically, the old Biloxi lugger, the big offshore boats that have the big towers, the outriggers that come down. What our bay fleet or our local fleet is moving in or moving towards are skimmer vessels. That technology was actually brought to us from Vietnam, and what they used over there, they brought here because it was designed in the same type of habitat. It was in shallow bay systems that they found. There's a type of net called a chopstick. Basically it's like a Siamese trawl. It looks like chopsticks off the front of the boat that pushes. And this is kind of a modification of that. But the skimmer boats are the ones that have the L-shaped frames that the net is actually tied to. So the net is actually tied to a rigid frame which has sleds that go off the bottom. Okay, so it's not actually dragged, it's kind of pushed or held through the water. And those are more efficient. They're better at catching white shrimp, which is the big shrimp that you buy off the boat here, if you buy from a local fisherman at one of the harbors, and it's a big shrimp, it's more than likely a pink shrimp because they stick around in the estuary longer than brown shrimp. Big brown shrimp, if you buy those are caught offshore because they move out before they get large. But the white shrimp tend to get up higher in the water column, and that historical otter trawl, unless it's a modified trawl with high sides or high wings or it's got a bib, those shrimp basically swim up above or kick up above the net. So a lot of our shrimpers are moving to this design, which is the second one. If you see that rigid frame, this is an old otter trawl style, old Biloxi lugger style boat where it's right on side the boat. They can catch things that are all the way up in the top of the water column because it drags or it's pulling all the way above the water. So it's more fuel efficient. It's a smaller boat, less people to operate the gear, and it can operate in a lot shallower water than the otter trawls can. So we have seen a trend in folks moving to the smaller skimmer trawl boats. In Louisiana, their inshore fishery is probably dominated significantly by these style boats. All right, oyster fishery, this is a tough one. So the wild harvest, we're all aware, Bonnie Carey Spillway opening in 2019 killed a significant number of oysters. I'm not sure of the exact percentage, but it was high percentage mortality in our oyster population, particularly in the Western Sound. So wild harvest season has not opened since then. There's potential for opening soon. I'm not involved with oyster fishery management directly, but we do a summer reef assessment survey that's done with dive assessments, meter square quadrats, where we go out and dive on a certain number of sites to determine how many oysters are out there, and that's how we base an opening. That opening's based on what we think we have of market class oysters for that year on the bottom and how many we could take or harvest and still leave enough in the water where they can spawn and reproduce and provide oysters for future harvest. So one of the newer things in the oyster realm are you see the baskets here. So off-bottom aquaculture is a new thing. It's not just here, it's everywhere. We've got an aquaculture park located south of Deer Island and a training program where they have a number of folks that apply and go through the training where we give them oysters, seed oysters, and we give them the gear or we loan it to them, and they can grow and learn how to do it, and they are obligated to go to certain training events to learn how to properly do it, and then they can sell the oysters at the end of that period of time, that 1 year training, and they don't have to outlay the capital that first year. So it's something to try to trigger growth in that industry. It's not really technically a fishery because they're farming. They're putting the material out there, smaller oyster seed, out into the environment, and they're growing them in a bag until they hit market size and they're harvesting. So it's not a wild harvest fishery, but it is something that can supplement a wild harvest fishery and fulfill a boutique niche market need for half shell oysters. They are more expensive typically. I don't know if anybody ever had any of these off bottom. It doesn't look like a typical oyster. Usually they're smaller. Legal size on those is smaller, but there's more meat to shell ratio, higher meat to shell ratio than an on bottom wild harvest oyster. They're cleaner, they're not on the bottom. Most of them pressure wash these things and they tumble them, and so they look different than what you would picture. But they have a lot better consistency because they can determine when to harvest based on salinity, so you can get a better product. I already mentioned to you the changes we've seen from the wooden sailboats. The old schooners eventually got into diesels. That's another skimmer boat there, that blue one on the right. Sonar availability for fishermen's been a big deal. A lot of them use, specifically the shrimp fishery uses chart plotters that are hooked up to their computer. They might have a laptop sitting on the dash so they can get right to their fishing grounds that they've had success catching shrimp at. So they track all that data, and they also use that to make sure they can avoid obstructions in the water, which is money out of their pocket when they hit that stuff. So crab traps, they've been around since the 70s. All right, technology. How much time do I have left? I need to wrap it up? Okay. We're going to roll through this last part quick because I think we've hit the high points. All right, so we are getting updated technology on the boats. The biggest things we get is reporting from the fishery. So we get, if it's a recreational fishery, the only way to get reporting is to do creel surveys or to have people report through an online system. So what we have here in Mississippi, the creel survey that we have, has anybody ever been interviewed? Anybody hook and line fishermen? You've been interviewed at the boat ramp? So historically it's been MRIP, which is a federally funded program. We're moving to hopefully a different program that'll give us a little bit better data, especially in regards to offshore fisheries, because of the way that data looks for offshore species. It's just not good for us. But that's the way we get recreational data. Commercial data, everything commercially caught and sold in Mississippi is supposed to be reported to us. So we get close to 100% of actual catch if everybody's compliant. Whereas it's not a survey base, it's mandatory reporting. And so we've moved to this electronic reporting system in the last couple of years. And so we can get a real-time estimate of how much is being harvested by species. Telemetry, some of the data collection stuff we do fishery independent wise, tagging, where we can track movement of fish in the watershed so we can see when they move in and out of certain areas, how long they stick around in our waters. I already mentioned catch estimated historically for commercial was port agents, so it was just an estimate where we get a subsample of what was being caught and offloaded. Now we get everything. Future may be QR codes like we see in the oyster fishery in some areas. So that's a paper trip ticket. This is the new electronic reporting form that we use. Another thing that we do are seafood safety inspections. A lot of our processing facilities, this is at one of our crab processors, they have to be inspected and certified and have a certain type of sanitation plan in place to make sure that we're protecting public health, especially for cooked product like this or for oysters. There's a pretty rigorous inspection process and certification process for anybody handling or processing oysters. This is some of the telemetry tagging stuff. The old way was just the spaghetti tags. If you caught the fish, you'd call the number and say, I caught the fish right here, and we'd know it got there eventually. Acoustic stuff is they basically pass through a gate. They've got a tag that pings, and those transmitters where they're set up, typically like at an ideal place would be at the CSX bridge here, because we could know what comes in and out through that gap. Okay. And we would know when that fish came through, what fish it was. Okay, the newest way, or the newest technology is satellite tags. The two scientists there are holding one with a triple tail. Those are pop-off tags that are designed to come off at a set interval, and they give to us a lot of other data, water quality data, how long they hung out in certain areas, that kind of thing. So you could look at migration patterns, and that can inform management a lot better. We do collect a lot of water quality information at every one of our sampling events that we do fishery independent wise. We do collect water quality because that helps us learn what limits these species have and when we should and should not expect to see certain things in certain areas. The autonomous thing there, that's not one of our drones there, but that's some stuff that some of the researchers are looking into as a way of monitoring water quality real time. Some of the other fishery independent stuff we do, I already mentioned trip tickets or electronic reporting in MRIP, but what you see scientists doing here is extracting an otolith from a red snapper. We can determine age of that specimen based on that, and we do that stuff all the time for most of our inshore and offshore finfish species. This is a couple of our scientists doing some of the crab work there and trawl work. We do use a variety of sampling techniques: trawls, gill nets, seines, dredges. We do dive sampling, the tagging work. Electrofishing is something that we're currently testing in our waters. It's something that's been used a long time in freshwater systems. It's tried and true, but the technology is kind of new for brackish water systems, just because of the fact that it's salty water. There's some other things you got to deal with there. So this is a couple of our folks there, just the trawl work. I'm not going to go through these a whole lot because we're going to need to cut this thing down a little bit. Gill nets. Obviously bigger specimens in the gill nets than the trawls. We're looking for a certain size class. It gives us a good cross section of a certain area, what the population of different species looks like. We do use crab traps in the bays and out front to track migration timing of crabs, to look at size and sex composition, and to look at bycatch of the gear. So we have an estimate of how much of other things we're catching, or our fishermen are catching in the traps. Seines, we're targeting really small stuff along the marsh fringe typically. It's getting a whole cross section of everything in the water column. And then this is a newer type setup. Y'all may have seen it. There's one of these sites set up here on the other side of the 90 bridge right off the beach. And the Gulf Coast Research Lab maintains that site. But we put these out when in the peak season for flounder as a fishery independent method for sampling flounder. It's been the most efficient way we could collect them, rather than just a lot of other gears like gill nets and trawls are inefficient for that species. So, all right. We're just going to blow through these here. One of the other things we do, artificial reef development. That's one of Research Lab's old boats that they donated to put out on one of the fish havens. We support projects, or we hold the permits in some cases and help obtain permits for folks that want to donate material. There's a lot of big industrial facilities like Ingalls and some of our contractors that donate culverts and pilings and things like that have to otherwise dispose of that material when it's replaced. And we can work within our permits to get this out to create habitat. 2 more slides. I mentioned to you already the derelict crab trap cleanup that we had this year. We do attend a lot of outreach events and educational events for kids. That's it.
I have a question that I'd like to. You've spoken a lot about quality of water and the care that you do for the fish and everything, and it's impressive. But since my husband and I have moved to this little hamlet from the water, and we had an artesian well, the quality of the water here is terrible. It is brown. And I don't understand it. They
Another
say,
whole story.
and I'm sure it is, but if anybody knows anything about it, would like to tell me.
I will tell you when you get through.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would rather be in fish.
I have a question. If you were lucky enough to catch a triple tip and it was tagged, should you put it back? Do you recall? What do you do if you catch a fish that is tagged?
If it's tagged, we at least want to get the tag back. It's not mandatory. You're not going to get in trouble for not turning the fish in or putting it back in the water. But the tags, especially if it's a satellite tags, those are very expensive, and we have to have the tag to be able to retrieve the data.
How old do they live?
Triple tail? Oh, that's a good question. I'm not a finfish guy, so I would be guessing at that, but I know some of our other species, like inshore species, we've had specimens that we've counted the rings on the otolith, basically cut a cross section, and you count the years of growth in the 20 to 30-year-old range. But I don't know specifically for that species.
Okay, thank you, Jason. That was great. There'll be a small test afterwards to see what your attention was.
Well, the other people didn't come. I can't meet you
Thank
people.
you all for being here.